Over 100 years ago, one man was giving a lecture in Dornach, Switzerland, when he revealed an interesting prophecy. He said that man would become more and more machine, and we would let our thoughts flow into machines. And this was before the days of even computers. But during the exact same speech, he said something else that was pretty interesting. He said that there was, at that time, a secret occult brotherhood who literally had it as their objective to keep all of mankind controlled, manipulated, and in the dark as to their own spiritual power. This particular gentleman actually might have known a thing or two about what these occult brotherhoods were up to, because he had been one of them.
Welcome to the Woo There It Is podcast.
Okay, but before we talk about him, let's talk about doppelgangers. It's just your twin. And in the age of the internet and in social media, in some ways, our online persona is kind of like our doppelganger. It's not us, but it's not us. And the more we use social media, the more we kind of become that doppelganger. We start to think in memes and emojis. And for some of us, that's an improvement. I'm just kidding. But it is interesting that one man was actually able to see this type of relationship coming over 100 years ago. And who am I talking about? I'm talking about Rudolf Steiner. And I've talked about him before in other podcasts, only briefly. He has a litany of available material discussing his beliefs, and he's actually a pretty brilliant guy. He was able to come up with an entire system of education, the Waldorf School. He also came up with biodynamic farming. If you've ever heard of that before, that was Rudolf Steiner over 100 years ago. He's a polymath, but he was no stranger to his more spiritual side because he was born psychic. So when he was just a kid, he was just sitting in this room when this woman walked into the room, and he thought that she looked like people in his family, and he's looking at her, and she turned directly to face him, and she said,
"Try to help me as much as you can now, as well as later in life."
And then she walked out of the room through the stove. And the next day, he would find out that one of his family members had actually committed. So having this very psychic side, Rudolf Steiner was an occultist, and he was actually a theosophist. And I'll get more into theosophy in another episode, but they were essentially, as nearly as I can tell, occultists. But he kind of didn't agree with them completely, so he actually split off and he created his own philosophy. He called it anthroposophy. But I think because he devoted so much time to understanding the more spiritual side of life and reality, he must have been able to gain certain insights that not many of us have access to. And so he was able to see, in some respects, the future of humanity. I think this must have been the case because during one of his speeches, this is documented, and he gave this speech in Switzerland in 1917. He said that at some point, humanity will have to solve the problem of how human states of mind, movements within the human soul, can be transferred to machines, and how the human being must be brought into connection with what must become more and more mechanical. Now, if that doesn't sound good to you, doesn't sound that great to me either. More on that in a second. But he later on says that, in a sense, the human being will be able to let his thoughts flow into machine forces. This reminds me of the movie Superman 3, when one of the bad characters towards the end, spoiler alert, one of the bad characters is trying to run away from this supercomputer, and it's going, like, the supercomputer is going bad or whatever. It's like a sentient AI, and it sucks her back in with electricity, and it covers her with like bolts and things and like all this metal stuff. And she turns her into this AI robot, and she goes around causing all kinds of destruction. It was the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. And I was 5 years old when that movie came out. But I digress. Back to Rudolf Steiner. Why was he bringing this up in 1917? This whole topic of how human beings might be merging with machine forces. Well, we're going to get into that. But let's take a step back. Let's talk about, just generally speaking, one of Steiner's beliefs. He said that people who don't believe in sort of the supernatural world, the world beyond the veil, he called it the supersensible world. He said for those people who don't believe in that, and they only believe in the earthly realm, he said when they die, they essentially get the world that they believed in. But then he said that when that happens, it leads to destructive forces being unleashed on the earth. Okay, I didn't know that. How is that possible? Okay, we're going to find out. So buckle in. Steiner says that all of us, this is very interesting, and I think I actually believe it. So he says that all of us, when we're born, we have a being that enters into our body with us. And he calls this being the Ahrimanic being. And what's interesting is that he says that we can't actually exist without it. So it has to be there as part of us being human. And it's actually in control of a lot of our electrical forces, a lot of the electrical activity that goes on inside of our body. And this Ahrimanic being, what it wants to do is control us throughout the entirety of our lives. What a dick. It wants to keep us under control. And what it really wants is to stay in control at the end of our lives. So at that moment of death, it would like to continue to control us. But Steiner says that it can't. It never can. Why? He says it's because Jesus Christ dying on the cross. So something about that particular act or sacrifice was so powerful that it meant that no Ahrimanic being would ever be able to do that, would ever be able to maintain control over a human being through that point of death. And he said if Jesus hadn't have done this, then we would all be under their control, and they would essentially, these Ahrimanic beings would be able to control the evolution of humanity on Earth. It's interesting to think about. But what's crazy is that when I think about this, so it seems really weird at first, but you guys probably know that I talk about Eckhart Tolle all the time. And Tolle talks about the ego and how there's this ego in us that essentially controls us. We go unconscious and the ego takes over. And it takes over by putting thoughts in our minds. And so we go throughout the day just kind of thinking. We're always like worried about the future or thinking about the past or looking at something on our phones. And I've definitely, even after reading Tolle, I've definitely spent entire days just being completely consumed with thoughts. And I think that one could say that those are days in which the Ahrimanic being, if it's the same thing as the ego, totally won the game. And Steiner even says that the Ahrimanic being, it controls you by putting thoughts in your head. And he says that it's way cleverer than you, but it doesn't have access to what he calls the world of feeling. So I take that to mean emotions. It doesn't have emotions. And then I'm reminded of what Abraham Hicks often talks about, which is, you know whether or not you are following your highest path by how you feel. If you feel cruddy, then you may not be in alignment. You're under the control of Ahrimanic being. But if you feel great, your emotion is better, you have good emotions, then you're maybe less under that control. And also interesting is that Steiner, he goes on to say that the only thing that can help us to counteract the influence of Ahrimanic beings is awareness. Awareness. That's very similar to saying presence. So if you are aware of your surroundings, you're aware of where you are, you're no longer lost in thought. So there you have it. Cure. So, okay, hopefully this all makes sense. And just to recap, there's an Ahrimanic being. It lives inside of you. It tries to control your thoughts so you cannot guide your own destiny. And 2, Superman 3 is a shitty movie. Don't watch it. Okay. So then Steiner goes on to talk. This is the topic that I shouldn't love, but I love it so much. Is he goes on to talk about occult brotherhoods. And he says that these occult brotherhoods are well aware of the Ahrimanic being. And not only that, but they're purposely keeping information about the Ahrimanic being secret. Okay, but why? So we're going to get back to why. But first, here's the weirdest part of the whole lecture. Steiner says that in 1841, there was a group of dark angels who essentially went to battle in the spirit realm with the light angels. I can't believe I'm saying this shit out loud. And what the dark angels wanted was to keep spiritual knowledge from sort of trickling into the earthly realm. But finally, by 1879, the dark angels lost the battle. And they were cast down to earth to be with us. Thank you. I didn't want that, but that's what happened. And it didn't make them innocuous. So I think either what happened then, although it's a little bit vague for me when reading Steiner, because everything he wrote is vague for me. I think either what happened was that they became the Ahrimanic beings that walk with us, or they started influencing the Ahrimanic beings. They know what things to say, and they know to talk to the Ahrimanic beings. They know to sort of how to control humans with putting in all kinds of horrible thoughts into our heads. Okay, but as a result of this, Steiner then says that as of 1879, all human beings who were born after then, and I'm paraphrasing what he said, but essentially he said, we've all had the ability to create our own reality. Basically, the law of attraction was born then. And it's kind of interesting if you think about it. Like, so before then, that means that we didn't really have that ability as much. And that makes a lot of sense, because like part of the reason we don't believe it now is because, well, if that's been true, then why haven't these people been creating their reality throughout, the thousands of years of human evolution? Because it wasn't available to us until 1879. That's an interesting thought. But on the other side of that coin is that if the law of attraction exists and you get what you think of, then people who only think of dark things and who only think that the 3D reality around them is all that's real, well, that's also what they get. And when they die, they get yoked to this earth, to this 3-dimensional earth. Okay, so that being the case, okay, let's get back to these occult brotherhoods. Why would they want to keep the truth hidden from the general population? So Steiner says that they wished to hide the truth because it helped them to maintain power over others. Okay, so they have this ability to create reality with their minds, and we don't, then they do have a one-up on us. And he said that there are even members of the group who go around promoting materialism. And that's a very interesting thing to think of. If that's still been going on, I mean, the first thing that pops into my head is a Pepsi commercial. I don't know why. But if you think about advertisement and all the sort of terrible things that get promoted, especially, in American society, it's all about materialism and this earthly world, like diamonds and jewels and money and cars and all that. And that has been pretty popular in America. So I kind of wonder if that's come from these left-hand, if in some part, there are these elite people who are left-hand path occultists who are part of promoting that with the intention of keeping us mesmerized by the 3-dimensional and never connecting to our higher spiritual side. Okay, great for them. They have a one-up on us because they understand law of attraction. Why would they go to that much trouble to keep people in the dark? Because I feel like just having that one-up isn't that much of a reward. Well, according to Steiner, he says that if a person dies with only materialist beliefs, then, like as I mentioned earlier, their soul is trapped in the earthly realm. But he says these Western occultists know how to then trap the soul in their lodge. And then they are able to use the forces that the powers that those souls have. And you can bet they're not using them to spread love and light. And here's a funny detail. Some of you may remember back in the 1800s, maybe even early 1900s, there was this huge wave, this huge trend of spiritualist seances. Well, he says that it was actually these left-hand path occultists who started that whole craze. And he said they did it for the purpose of further convincing people in only the materialist realm. And I have to be honest, that doesn't make sense to me, because if I was involved in a seance and my dead loved one came back to say something to me, I would be pretty convinced that there's an afterlife. So I feel like I would be less materialist. And the only way this possibly kind of makes sense to me is if I think that they were used to just scare the shit out of people. And then those people would go to these seances and maybe they would even have like a spirit attached to them. Like they could send a spirit with them to just torment them all the time. Then they'd be living in fear all the time. And when you're in fear, you're definitely not in the present moment. And you're definitely not connected to your higher self. So that way, I kind of get it, if that's what he's saying. But ultimately, this whole plan, according to Steiner, backfired on the occultists. Because he said that what ended up happening was that these spirits who the occultists were controlling, they ended up telling the people who were at the seances what the occultists were doing to them. And that gave the whole secret away. And so that's when the left-hand path got to work discrediting the entire spiritualist movement. But if you ask me, it makes more sense that the occultists would promote the spiritualist movement with the intention of fully debunking it later on, because that would definitely destroy a lot of people's faith. So maybe that was their plan. I'm not sure. But it reminds me of the Fox sisters, which some of you may have heard of them before. They were basically, I think they essentially were the reason that the spiritualist movement took off to begin with. So they would conduct seances and they would essentially have conversations with the dead, supposedly. And they would ask questions, and in response to their questions, the spirits would knock. So, I don't know, 1 for yes, 2 for no, or something like that. And they became a huge sensation. So many people were having seances with the Fox sisters. But then ultimately what would end up happening is that their lives kind of went into shambles. And one of them even became a pretty bad alcoholic. One of them ultimately would end up signing an affidavit saying that they faked the entire thing. And that was the end of the story. Everybody was like, oh, seances are bullshit. The whole spiritualist movement is nonsense. But what if they were literally threatened or blackmailed or bribed to say that they faked the whole thing by these left-hand path occultists? We may never know. And this also reminds me, this is kind of random, but there's a couple of YouTubers named Sam and Colby, but they interacted with this couple. I can't remember the couple's name. I'll link it in the show notes. But they interacted with them. The couple claims that when they connect to each other, so they hold hands or hold each other's arms, then they somehow get some sort of connection to the spirit realm. And so they will ask, it's this exact same process that the Fox sisters used, where they ask questions and then you could hear some sort of tapping noise in response to their question. And if they want to spell out something, they'll be like A, B, C, and then you'll hear like a knock. And so they're like, okay, first letter is C. And that's how they'll spell out a word or a name. And what's interesting is that Sam and Colby, I know they're YouTubers. They make lots of money by getting people to believe in ghosts. But I do actually think that they are in good faith. And they did take the time to try to debunk this couple. And they brought them out of the environment that they were normally in. I think they brought them out to some graveyard or something. And they even made them change shoes. They did a bunch of things to try and debunk them. And they still were able to hear the knocking noises. So I really struggle with that one. It could just be an elaborate magic trick that I'm just not clever enough to figure out. Because I'll be honest, when it's so perfect, where you have these knocking noises that happen at just the right time and spell out names perfectly, it's hard for me to believe that that's real, because, communication beyond the veil it seems like it's very rarely straightforward unless you're in a dream. Okay, but let's go back to the topic of man merging with machine. So Steiner says this is inevitable. He says it's simply the next stage of evolution of mankind on Earth. And he says that and I have a thought about that in a second. He says, while we cannot fight this happening, we can determine how it happens. Will mankind take the next step in an egoic, anti-human manner, just like what the members of the left-hand path want? Or will we take this step in a spiritually conscious and compassionate manner? And again, guys, I don't like the idea of becoming a machine at all. But Steiner, he was looking into the future from his perspective in 1917 of somebody who doesn't even know that we're going to be sitting at computers someday. And maybe when he saw what he saw, that's how he took it. But what it really is the precise relationship that we have with our machines now, where, we have a phone that's often in our hands and we're communicating with it and we're putting thoughts into it, but we're not technically 100%, we're not melded with the machine. So maybe we are exactly where Steiner predicted over 100 years ago. And if that's the case, then the question becomes, have we taken this next step in human evolution on the right or the left-hand path? Okay, that was super cheesy, but that is the end of the episode. I tried to end it poetically. Thank you for listening to the Woo There It Is podcast. This is Savannah Steele wishing you all peace, joy, and happiness. Bye.